Hello. We are live today talking about perfectionism. How is perfectionism showing up in your lives, and what is it costing you, as well as giving you some tools to overcome it, recognize it, and overcome it that might help you. I'm joined today by coach and psychologist Claire Vowell. I can see her here, and I'm going to add her to the conversation now and invite her. And here she is. A few more seconds, and I'm sure she'll be joining us. Lovely. Hi.
Hello.
Oh, fantastic. Hello, Claire. Thanks for joining.
Let's turn everything up a little bit.
Yes. Perfect. Now we have beautiful images.
Amazing.
We can see each other. Fantastic. I'm so glad that we made some time today to talk about this topic that's so dear to both of our clients. Both of our clients are high achievers, whether they're working or not working. I know you help female founders specifically. So I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself briefly before we move into the topic of perfectionism and how it's showing up.
Well, thank you for organising everything. I think you're right. It is such an important topic. It comes up all the time, certainly in my work, and I know it comes up in your work with clients all the time too. I am Dr. Claire Vowell, known as Claire to friends and family. I am a chartered psychologist and also a coach. And as you say, I specialise in supporting high achieving women, female founders, other executives, really with mindset, making sure that they are not holding themselves back, helping them with things like perfectionism, procrastination, setting, managing, holding boundaries, all of these kinds of things.
Thank you. That's a beautiful introduction. I wanted to dive straight away into the topic of perfectionism. And if you were to describe perfectionism, because this is a word, that we hear a lot and is used a lot, and we'll go into examples, because this is, I think, what's the most useful for clients is to hear about examples, recognize themselves, realizing that maybe they don't go through exactly the same kind of struggles, but it's similar to what they're going through. How would you describe perfectionism in your own words?
Yeah. So when we're talking about perfectionism, we're really talking about when people set themselves very, very high standards. And what we're really thinking about is unrealistically high, often unachievable high standards. Accompanying that, so we have the high standards on the one side, but it's also accompanied by self-criticism if the standards aren't met. So it's not kind of the setting of a high standard and then let's see if I get there if I don't. If you don't meet the high standard, a perfectionist will be highly self-critical, and they will tend to focus on the negative. So instead of focusing on all the great things that might have been achieved along the journey and maybe getting 80% there, the perfectionist will always focus on what wasn't achieved. And importantly, for a perfectionist, we're really talking about self-worth being tied up in that achievement.
Thank you. Yes. So I hear a lot about expectation, and I see here we've been joined by Chelsea, Rima. Thank you for everybody who's joined. This expectation that we set for ourselves, and it shows up, I guess, in every aspect of our lives, not just at work, but as parents or outside as spouse and partners. And we have those expectations for ourselves. And is it fair to say that then those expectations are also the ones that we may have for others as well? Does that perfectionism, which is, not matching those expectations in yourself, does it also translate to others with your clients? Do you see that happening?
Yeah, two really great points actually that I will answer the question and then come back to the other point about where it shows up. Yeah, absolutely. Perfectionists tend to hold very high standards for other people in their lives also. And what happens then is when the standards that somebody holds aren't met, they feel disappointment, they feel unworthy, they feel maybe judged, they feel not good enough. So all the same feelings crop up. But the interesting thing is that the other person might not even have been aware of that expectation. I can remember a very strange example, but I remember in the early days when I was dating my husband and I'd been on a trip somewhere, and in my head I had this idea that he should come and pick me up from the airport. Now I didn't express this, I didn't tell him, but I had this idea of, you know, a perfect relationship. Your husband or partner, boyfriend, whatever it was at the time, would be so excited to see you. He'd be waiting at the airport, and of course I got to the airport and he wasn't there because I told him I was going to get the tube or whatever it was to get home. And I was just this crushing disappointment
Yes.
because this bizarre expectation that I had and this high standard, this unachievable high standard that I had projected onto somebody else wasn't met.
Yes, that's so I think that's so common, right? We project those things, and I like this idea of projection because at the end of the day, it is about ourselves. You know, perfectionism are the standards that we have set up for ourselves that I guess we believe, as you're saying, is the norm, or it's how things should be, whether it's a relationship, how we show up as parent, how we perform at work, and it's not necessarily the reality. So it's a lot of things that we project or we imagine, and by doing that we are actually I like to think about it this way, and I would love to hear what you think of that. It's very much like we lose the power over our decision in a way, because we are projecting things onto others. We are giving the power to the other person to actually disappoint us, because could it be a lack of information or communication, but that perfectionism is also costing us. What I'm thinking is it's costing us this control of who we want to be and where we want to go, and we're giving that power to the other person to disappoint us at the end of the day. I don't know what you think of that idea of lack of power.
I agree with it. I think it's a really interesting way to frame it because it is relinquishing control and power in some way, isn't it? You know, it's and the problem is when all of these standards are in our head, you know, and that's where they're living, you know, these expectations, these standards, it's really setting everybody else around us up to fail.
Yes.
You know, almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy that we feel we're not worthy of love, and therefore we create these internal standards that somebody else can't meet. And then, you know, our brains love to be right. So look, oh, there we go. They didn't meet the standards. I was right all along. I'm not worthy of love.
Yes. So that's I think a good place to maybe give more examples of how perfectionism is showing up with your high achievers, female founders, clients.
I think, you know, you make such a great point about, you know, the underlying point here is that perfectionism shows up in all sorts of places. We can be perfectionists in one area and not perfectionists in another. More typically, if somebody, you know, has strong perfectionist traits, it tends to kind of crop up in lots of different areas. And I think that's a really useful thing to think about because we traditionally, I would say, we look at perfectionism, would think about it in sort of a work performance type context. But as you really, you know, rightfully points out, it can show up in all sorts of places. It shows up in our parenting, you know, relationships as the examples I've shared. For women in particular, you know, men also, but perhaps women in particular, it shows up in things around body image, you know, how I feel about my appearance. There's lots of perfectionism that shows up there. If I'm thinking about sort of more business coaching, you know, the work I do there, places it would show up, if we're setting ourselves unachievably high standards, we sometimes don't show up at all, you know. So we might be waiting for the right time or until we've got the right skills or the right qualification or the right experience. And sometimes that means missing out on opportunities altogether. You know, so it could be, you know, if you're in employment, it could be that you don't put yourself forward for that promotion. You know, perhaps if you're a working mum and you know, perhaps if you're a mum and you're looking to get back into the workforce, you don't apply for that job because you feel, you know, you can't meet your own high standards. It also shows up in things like, I don't know, social media. You know, lots of the entrepreneurs I work with, you know, have big social media presences, but maybe they don't show up on lives because they can't meet their own standards. You know, there's lots and lots of avoidance. Lots and lots of criticism that goes with, you know, lots of expended, wasted energy on the focus on I could have done better, I should have done better. You know, lots of these shoulds crop up.
Yeah.
So I see it a lot where people end up really wasting time and energy, you know, going back over things that, you know, a presentation that they've given, perhaps, you know, maybe they're presenting to investors and it didn't go so well. You know, lots and lots of time spent focusing on mistakes and wasting energy on what's gone
Yes.
wrong, focusing on the negatives.
Yes. Thank you. When you share this, I remember, you know, I was thinking about the commonality trait over December, January, of sentences that I was hearing from clients.
Mm.
And I don't know if you hear this one a lot. I'm not organized. I don't know where to
Mm.
start. I'm always feeling overwhelmed. I don't have enough time. You know, all of these sentences, you know, I wrote them down and I thought to myself, you know, this is where we help our clients. We help them around, like you said, changing the mindset around these things.
Mm.
And it starts with, you know, perfectionism. We know is there, and it's a big word, but what we actually do is we take those sentences and we try, right, and give them a different meaning.
Mm.
Like for instance, I'm not organized. This, like you said, it's not always true. We're not always not organized,
Mm.
but for them to really feel that, you know, it's exactly the things you've mentioned. Let's break it down. Where is it that you're not showing up organized? What can we do about that in particular? And then maybe we can find a different way to talk about it. But when they're in that state of overwhelm and not feeling organized, they're in that
Mm.
state that it's very hard for them to actually just say, oh, I'm being a perfectionist here, let me now move on from that perfectionism mindset and let me be motivated. And this is where I think coaching is very, very important, because we recognize it, but then I guess now the idea is how you move on from that recognition into how you help clients around that. I just wanted to kind of pause a second, Claire, because Joseph, who introduced each other,
Ah.
has just joined the live. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, Joseph, you've made this happen. So Joseph is a wonderful also coach for transition, in particular, great speaker. So you should check him out definitely. And I see Sophia has also joined us. So hello, Sophia. So I guess yes. Do you also hear those sentences a lot? As it's not an excuse; it's really how clients
Mm.
feel in the moment, right?
Yeah.
And how do you get on with those, you know, when they bring those big statements, those big labels of who they are as not being organized or not being
Mm.
capable, etc.? How do you help them when they bring those questions or sentences?
Yeah, so I think for me, you know, these sorts of sentences don't necessarily, or it's not necessarily always related to perfectionism. But what comes up for me is this idea around being able to change your story. So we get so wed to a particular identity. I'm disorganized. I'm, you know, stressed. Even I think people can really attach to this idea of always being stressed. I'm busy. I'm all of these things. And I do think the first step is always to help people to recognize that we have power and autonomy over our story. You know, we can change our narrative. You know, and obviously perfectionism plays into this very much, but you know, it could be other things. I'm another one that comes up for me. You know, I'm anxious. I'm an anxious person, and I think giving people, just empowering people to recognize that they can change their story, is like the baseline. You know, that's so important, just to give back that sense of control. So I think I would start there. Um, when I'm working with perfectionism in particular, you know, is sort of a specific sort of route. I would want to understand, and again, linking back to this idea of kind of attaching to, fixing to a particular identity. This happens a lot in perfectionism. You and I have talked about this. You know, I think that the title of the chat was around, you know, the fear of letting go of perfectionism,
Yes.
because and this really comes up a lot with my clients. I was working with somebody yesterday and we were talking things through, and you know, I just realized how much resistance there was. You know, I was like, you know, let's dig into this a bit more, because actually, you know, she wasn't getting the negative She wasn't really connecting with the negative impacts of perfectionism. And what we uncovered was that she was terrified of letting go of these behaviors and these standards because she was terrified of what that would mean about her. She felt that if she let go, she would not, she was worried about how she'd be perceived at work. You know, she was constantly striving, constantly setting these high standards. And she was terrified that if she kind of let drop the ball
Yes.
and did something in a different way, she wouldn't be perceived in the same way at work. So that was terrifying for her as an employee.
Yes.
It was terrifying for her self-image. She was like, she's always been in her family a high achiever, she's got a great job, all of these things. And who would she be without that achieving? So really, really interesting. And again, just relating back to that sense, that identity, I think sometimes, particularly with perfectionism, people sort of wear it as a bit of a badge of honor. I don't know whether you've seen that in your work. It's almost something to be proud of.
Yes, you've shared this example, and I want to ask you, what I wanted to kind of ask you, what do you think perfectionism is costing her, this particular client?
Exhaustion, burnout, and she's like on a hamster wheel, always trying to achieve more, achieve more,
Yes,
achieve more.
yes,
And because of her own internal standards, nothing is ever good enough.
yes,
Either she falls short and the self-criticism is intense, or she achieves, but she's achieved that standard, she still doesn't believe in herself, so she sets
yes,
another goal, even higher, even higher, even higher. So it's this relentless pursuit.
yes,
Leads to a lot of stress. It can often lead to anxiety, depression. It can often lead, ironically, because the story we tell ourselves is that this is all about achieving and productivity and getting to the next level. Interestingly, it often leads to decreased productivity, often leads to procrastination. I've certainly experienced that, where you're so terrified of getting something wrong, or it not being perfect, that you can't get started. I remember in a work context, I'd been asked to do a strategy deck for something. This was in my previous, life when I was employable. I remember being asked to do a strategy deck for something, and I think it was for an investor meeting. It was kind of a big, important piece of work, and I was so terrified of not creating this perfect thing. I just couldn't get started. I could not even get started.
yes,
It was just absolute
yes.
paralysis.
And you were talking about this all or nothing
Mm.
mentality or personality or trait, in a way that you can change, of course,
Mm.
when you do work on yourself. So what you're saying is, what it's costing the person is perfectionism is costing them to get to actually what they want, and to get it in a way that they feel confident enough to take that next step. They
Mm.
would rather not even try or find
Yeah.
excuses
Yeah.
than trying. And we haven't touched upon it in detail yet, but I think it's key now to maybe bring up where it's coming from. And like you said, it's something that you struggle to detach yourself from, but that's also because it's a learned skill. Like anything um, you can learn in different ways, how to come out of maybe a bad habit.
Yeah.
You can train yourself to come out of that bad habit. Perfectionism, like anything, is very attached to emotions. And to me, someone who's showing a lot of perfectionistic traits is somebody who has a lot of maybe fear, the fear of failing, but
Yeah.
it's because they have probably failed at something, or they have been. And there's also, I don't know if you notice that as well, it's a lot of rejection. So the high achievers, the high achiever women that may have had a successful academic upbringing, they were fantastic in school and university, they may have been rejected at some point in their life, whether it's at the beginning. So for instance, I have an example of someone who's been rejected from a senior school, and that has impacted her so much
Mm.
that it's showing up today, 30 years later, 35 years later. Or somebody else who's been bullied in a work environment, and has failed and was criticized, and the perfectionism has started to increase even more and more and more and more. So it's very much related to kind of a traumatic experience, not a big T trauma, but a small T trauma. And it's kind of feeding the narrative of that traumatic experience, or a failure of a sport event where they were, for instance, in front of an audience and they failed in front of people, and they made it they made it a validation, like you said, of the label that they made of themselves. And here it's very interesting, because some people will be like, oh, I failed, but then I went back on the horse, and this has made the person that I am. But I don't think we were really taught, as much as maybe now, with all the mindset and well-being, we're being taught on going back on that horse and try again, and it doesn't define you and everything. I think it was harder back then for our parents to maybe talk about it as a learning thing, and let's not quit, but let's try. There wasn't so much language and around parenting and all of that. And I'm wondering, what do you think of that? Like, do you think it stems from failures that weren't tackled in the right way, or that were too defining, and therefore, as a result, perfectionism is having too much space because we're allowing it? It was allowed to creep
Yeah.
in.
But I think perfectionism is really complicated, and when we dig into it in a sort of substantial way, for want of a better word, to tackle it properly, you do really need to be doing the sort of work that you do, the sort of work that I do, really digging deep and really understanding, the history. Where has it come from? You're absolutely right that it is fear-based. It's fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of rejection. What is really interesting, all of the examples you give are correct, that it can come from an experience where you failed and it felt devastating. So we often see, if we track back sort of to sort of childhood, perhaps, if somebody has overly critical parents, where this would be the sort of standard explanation: very critical parents, nothing was ever good enough, and that's what you internalize. What's really interesting is that it also can stem from parents who can be very loving and that have extremely high expectations. So what I've seen quite regularly is high achieving family history, so where you have, perhaps, I don't know, let me think of an example, parents that are lawyers, and they're lovely parents, they're supportive, they're wonderful, but they have extremely high bars for their kids. Now the kids might meet that, but what they internalize is that I'm only worthy, I'm only lovable if I get A's at A level, if I go to Cambridge, if I get into a magic circle law firm. So it can kind of come from different places. Sometimes, as you say, it could crop up from school experiences or workplace experiences. So if you have a workplace, for example, that really emphasizes achievement, and I see people, for example, I work with quite a lot of people from sort of the big four or consultancy firms, and I see this a lot. Achievement is, emphasized. It is all about the achievement. I know, some of these firms have leaderboards. Someone I'm working with at the moment who really struggles with perfectionism talks to me about the leaderboard they have at work. So, this idea of achievement is tangible, is visible, it's right in front of your face. And it depends, I think, when feedback, whether that's from caregivers, whether it's in school, whether it's in the workplace, when feedback is focused on the mistakes versus the successes and celebrating the wins, that really exacerbates the perfectionist traits.
Yes, yes, thank you. I think, looking at the time, what would be very useful now is to maybe give some tools for our listeners, and for the ones that will listen it after, with the recording, how we can, recognize, but more specifically, what we can do when we see perfectionism creeping in. Is there anything that you recommend to your clients around that, to do themselves, after the session? That
Yeah,
is something very,
absolutely.
yeah. And
Absolutely.
hi, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah's also written something
Oh,
here a really interesting perspective that an experience can have such a profound impact on you 30 years on. Good to remember how the body really keeps the score. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
went to listen to the Body Keeps the Score author together. So that's a
Oh
nice,
wow!
yes,
Oh, how fantastic!
wonderful.
That's really amazing. Where would I start? So I think, in any sort of psychological or behavioural change, awareness is key. So be curious, notice where it's showing up.
Yes.
And I would say, curious is the C we want, not critical. We want to just be noticing, thinking about where it's showing up, what's going on. I talk to my clients a lot about good enough. What would good enough look like? And this is really hard for perfectionists. So a particular technique I use is thinking about the 70% rule. So good enough is hard to conceptualize as a perfectionist. It's like, well, good enough is that. It's like, no,
Yeah.
that's unachievable. That's perfect. What would good enough look like? And just trying to kind of dial things down enough. So what would it look like 70%? So what would being, fully engaged in playing with your kids 70% of the time? Would that be okay? What would doing 70% of a presentation look like? What would showing up on social media 70% happy with
Yes.
the content
Yes.
you've written? Now 70% is an interesting one to, I mean, it's an arbitrary number. I do find that with people who really struggle with perfectionism, it can be helpful to say, okay, well, 70% feels too hard. Why don't we start with 90%? What would happen if we just dialed things down by 10%? And then, I think remembering that this work is a journey, that it's a process. I would describe myself as a recovering perfectionist. I've done a lot of work on this. I generally I'm okay with maybe 80% most
Yes.
of the time,
Wonderful.
but I do notice, and I would encourage. I notice that if I am stressed or in new situations, it can crop up again. So back to the curiosity and noticing and awareness piece. The overall aim really is we want to set ourselves realistic expectations. Thinking about what is actually achievable, and what would be realistic for me with the time, energy, resources I have available. And when we set ourselves reasonable expectations, we set ourselves up to win, we set ourselves up for success. And our brains love
Yes.
love success. It helps with motivation, it helps with our confidence. So being able to achieve, ironically still talking about achievement, being able to achieve those, the expectations we set ourselves, really start to mend, to support that possibly quite damaged sense of self-worth. And that's what we're looking at really, is rebuilding that confidence,
Yes.
making sure we feel okay. Once we get to a certain level, I would say practice, being okay with making mistakes. That's a hard one. But really important, if you can sit with, it's okay. I'm like, so then I would start to possibly talk about the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So, really think about what can I learn from that experience, what went well, what can I take forward. All of those kind of things can really help too.
Yes. Thank you. I like this kind of analogy of progress, and at the same time where I really emphasize with clients is that we're not looking to diminish, like you're saying, your performance or motivation. We are just like, it's important to have very unrealistic goals, and setting those wow, trying
The
to reach for the
vision.
stars,
Yeah, yeah.
and having those incredible goals are key. I think where perfectionism is so difficult there is that you've got those goals that you want to achieve, and ideally, if you can, create goals that are in line with what you want, with your values, then they make even more sense, right?
Yes.
And that can also even help tackle perfectionism in that way, because you connect to it and you feel in love with your goal, and then it's easier to then create even smaller steps. And it's very much sometimes what I find useful with clients is a projection, a very short-term projection of where they see themselves in 60
Mm-hmm.
days or 90 days, and to have, and that comes from the gap and the gain the book that I highly recommend. And it's like you said, like let's focus on the gains, right, rather than focusing on the gaps.
Yeah.
So what are all the things on my to-do list that I haven't done? This is depressing when you go to bed thinking about all the things you haven't done. But what you can just focus on before going to bed is, okay, what are 3 things I've done that I'm happy about? Okay, what are 3 things I want to do tomorrow?
Yeah.
And that kind of changes the perspective. That's a small exercise that you do it once, you do it twice, you do it 3 times. Sometimes your kids, if they're old enough, they can do it as well before bedtime. And I've got 3. One has picked up on it, the other 2 not so much, but there's been a moment where they did, and it does change, that it does change a little bit how they go to bed, not just thinking about, oh, I don't want to go to school tomorrow, but at least the discussion is about, okay, I've achieved this. And it's like you said, and I think that really helps with perfectionism. And I really love the percentage 70%, because I think for perfectionists it gives a little bit of a, oh, okay, so I relieved that I'm not that bad of a person if I'm not the best mom 100% of the time. And another thing that I want to add to this thing that has helped clients is to not view time as linear, and to kind of view buckets of time. Like, for instance, if you're understanding your period of life, so if right now your priority is work because you've just joined a new job, and you're not going to be very present at home, it's easier to embrace the 70% at home, or even less, in a way, and justify it, because the next, I don't know, 6 months might be the months that you might get a promotion, so you want to give it all and kind of own to that. But when you will need to be more present at home for whatever reason, maybe your child needs to have educational psychologist assessment, or that person needs more time with you and all of that, kind of being also okay that you will be, like you said, 70% at work, right? So I like this concept of, you can strive for perfection in some areas, and you just can't strive for perfection every time in the same area everywhere at all. It is not possible to be striving for perfection in everything in your life at the same time. But it can be, yes, you strive for perfection at work for a bit, then it will be as parent, and it's okay. Like, it is okay.
I mean, I think, we'd be talking about striving for high standards versus striving for perfection. I think the more that we can, remove that kind of idea, the better. But what you're talking about, introducing this flexibility. And that's really hard for perfectionists. Perfectionists tend to be quite rigid, in that it has to be, yeah, exactly like you said at the beginning, all or nothing. It has to be this, it has to be, or it's a failure. So yeah, absolutely thinking about introducing that flexibility. And I think, I guess the other thing I would say is just, and again, sort of speaking to where you can get sort of paralyzed, it's taking imperfect action. It's just doing something. Taking imperfect action is really helpful.
Yes. I sent to my mailing list about the live, and then I realized that there was a spelling mistake in the email, because I typed it quite quickly, and yes, and I felt it inside of myself, like, oh. But then I thought, it's just I tweaked 2 letters, and it does creep in, constantly, even though we work on it, and we know that it doesn't necessarily define us and everything. Yes, I guess it is a good time to stop, even though we could speak much more. Do you want to share with the audience and people listening how they can connect with you? If there's anything you're working on that you want to share, let us know.
I have a couple of spaces for one-to-one coaching coming up, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that that's where we can really see transformation. Working on perfection, but all the other things we mentioned at the beginning. I just would encourage anybody who wants to just connect either here on Instagram, or I tend to hang out a little bit more on LinkedIn. So I'm Dr. Claire Vowell on LinkedIn. And it tends to pop up quite easily, and we can just arrange a chat and see if it would be a good fit for you. And so that would be what I would suggest.
Thank you so much. And yes, I guess for the listeners who want to work on perfectionism, especially, at the beginning of January when there's so many, new habits that people want to implement, maybe, if there is there anything you want to tell them if they are starting something new or wanting to implement a new habit like exercising, what do you want to tell them?
Oh,
Um,
habits. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, which is another one of my favourite topics. Um, I think, I guess we're talking about perfectionists. I would think about redefining success. I would be focusing on growth over, that sort of flawless execution. Thinking about good enough again. Um, so we know with habits, it doesn't matter in terms of habit building. It doesn't matter if you set yourself as a task, I'm going to go to the gym 5 times a week. If you don't go to the gym one day, it doesn't matter. Your analogy, you get back on the horse, you go again. So yeah, I think it would be about redefining what success looks like, and having that flexibility in your habit building.
Love that. We will leave the audience with that, and they can reach out to you for more questions. Thank you so much, Claire. I wish you a
Thank you so
fantastic
much.
day. Thank you, everyone who joined, and speak soon. Bye for
Thank
now. Bye.
you. Bye bye.